What can we learn from the Gaucho's traditional knife? Well, that's what we'll talk about in this video, and giving this historic character and his way of life and his selection of tools, I think there's something there for us to learn from. Folks, this is Fernando doing another video for the Modern Survivalist, and as always, if you want to learn more about the practical aspect of survival and preparedness, street survival skills, and for the economic aspect, surviving the economic collapse, both available in the links there below. So, before we even talk about the Gaucho's knife and what we can learn from that and his choice in terms of blades, we have to define first what a Gaucho actually is. Now, if you watch certain Disney movie, little cartoon, they would show like the Gaucho as the equivalent of the North American cowboy, but in his South American version, all right? So North America had his cowboy, and in South America, you had a Gaucho, a man that worked in the field with animals and whatnot. That is close enough, but it really doesn't show the complete picture, and it is important to understand that context if you fully understand his choice of tools or weapons, and more on that later. But your traditional cowboy would be a man that worked with cows, with horses, often associated with a certain ranch, a certain enterprise of some kind, but it was basically a man that spent a lot of time on a horse working in the field, mostly with animals. Let me know if that's kind of like what a cowboy traditionally is in the comments below, if I'm far from that accurate definition. But yeah, basically cowboy dude in the far west or back in the day working in the field with animals and so on. The Gaucho was a bit different than that. Yes, a Gaucho would sometimes work for a big farm, a big, estancia, as it's called, like in Argentina, like a large landowner. And by large landowner, I mean, even till this day, it's massive extensions of land. Even till this day, there's parts in Patagonia where you can drive all day long and not see another soul. There's parts where you can drive all day long and not even leave the property of a single man, which is an entire debate on its own. But you're looking at a man that was often on the wrong side of the law. That is a key aspect to consider. The cowboy usually was working, and yes, you could have some that were like, stealing cattle and whatnot, but usually the cowboy was just the guys that worked with the animals, with the cows and the horses. The Gaucho was more of a drifter. The Gaucho was more of a guy that wanted to be on his own and be left alone, and if someone came and tried to screw with that style of life, he would either run away or fight. And yes, it would be the case, and if he needed money, he would work for a while, and they knew how to work with animals. But more often than not, especially the Gaucho of old, which no longer exists, the Gaucho, the real legit Gaucho, is a character that no longer exists. You have guys today in the fields and working in Argentina and other parts of South America that, yeah, they dress up like in a more traditional way, and they will usually have, till this day, they will have a knife that is very similar to this or a larger version, but a facón knife, the traditional Gaucho knife, even till this day, more because of a matter of tradition. They will have a knife that is not all that different from this knife, or maybe something like this, a little bit bigger, which it's probably a little bit more utilitarian, given the realities that they have these days. A Gaucho would fight against Indians, the natives. A Gaucho would be conscripted by the government against his will and forced to go and fight. And many of them have done exactly that. And they were tough individuals. They were used to fending for themselves, living off the land, fighting against both Indians and the government and the crown or whatever the hell was getting on their way, and killing an animal here and there, cutting a chunk of meat that they wanted and moving on. They weren't exactly the environmentalists living off the land, using every single bit of the animal. Screw the animal. The Gaucho did whatever it is he wanted to do so as to survive, and if he killed a cow and only ate the tongue, which was apparently a common thing, that's what he did, and he went on with that. And if he finally settled, he basically built a shack and under a big tree that provided some shade, and that was it. That was him. And if he needed any social interaction, he went to a pulperia. A pulperia is a little bit of a different type of establishment, maybe not as well known in the United States. In the United States, you had maybe like a general store, but a general store was part of some camp, some settlement, some buildings. No, a pulperia was more like an outpost. It was an outpost that was both general store, liquor store, place of gathering, dancing, and playing guitar a little bit, and socializing, and yes, very often, damn, fighting because of honor, because people were drunk, and defending yourself, and so on. So it was extremely common that a gaucho would have to bring out his knife to defend himself from attackers, from robbers. Most commonly, I would say, defend himself, defend his honor, and just deal with other drunk, angry gauchos that wanted to try one another. And this is something that actually Charles Darwin in 1830 saw with his very own eyes. Unfortunately for us, he wrote about it. What is it that Darwin wrote about? Well, he wrote about his trip to South America, reaching down to the end of the world and seeing the locals, and he was surprised by how many of the locals were all cut to bits. They would have scars across their faces, scars, a lost eye, horrible knife cuts all over their bodies. And it would surprise someone that was not used to that sort of thing, because unlike the cowboy, which cowboys were not all gunslingers. I mean, some cowboys would have a revolver, a carbine, a gun, or two or three, whatever. Realistically, most of the working cowboys, many of them probably didn't even have a gun with them. Maybe they kept it with their horse, but all day long having two revolvers on either side, that is more of a Hollywood thing rather than what a real cowboy would actually need. Sure, some of them would have a revolver. Some of them may have two. I would assume that it was very rare to find a cowboy, like a real cowboy, working cowboy with two revolvers. That just doesn't seem practical at all. But it wasn't the case that they were all gunslingers fighting one another and shooting one another all day long. The gaucho kind of did that a lot more. The gaucho would get into an argument with someone and say, you know what? Let's go. And it was often the case that it was a fight up until drawing blood. The first one that cut the other guy was the one that won, and that would be it. It wasn't always a matter of killing the other person. In fact, maybe one of the best known literally written about the cowboy, the Martín Fierro, which is a book about a cowboy. Well, he disgraced himself by killing someone in rage. He was in one of these arguments that happened. Just imagine people that spend a lot of time on their own and they socialize only in places where they drink alcohol. In 1830, yes, arguments did happen, and insulting one another's honor was a thing. So the story goes that the main character got into a fight, and he just saw red. He just let his anger take the best of him, and he ended up killing the guy he was dueling with, which was, in his own words, a way of disgracing himself. He was disgracing himself by killing the guy that he was just supposed to draw blood and then, collect himself and let it be. So when he disgraced himself, he had to run to the desert. The desert was just basically heading south until you hit the damn Indians or reach the fucking end of the world in Ushuaia or something like that. But basically leave civilization entirely, okay? That was what you did when you disgraced yourself and the law was coming after you because you killed someone. But going back to the purpose and the use of the facón knife, this was, as you see, this is mostly a fighting knife. The facón was mainly a fighting knife. Now, I've read from people that know a heck of a lot about knives that, yeah, the facón was a general use knife. And I have described it like that myself, because it is true that the gaucho, not the cowboy, the gaucho would use his knife for everything, including fighting, dueling. You would see them practicing and training with sticks so as to work on their reflexes and use a poncho, and the kind of thing you would imagine they would do so as to train in things that they need it for real often enough. The big difference between what you see in Hollywood regarding cowboys and duels, walking and shooting one another, that is a done deal. Once someone gets shot, it's kind of, you're not doing that all the time. It was actually very rare that you had guys walking down in the middle of the street of the town and drawing and shooting on one another. Now, fighting for honor until first blood is drawn, that was fairly common occurrence, and maybe it would be a form of even entertainment for many of them, either participating or watching others do this themselves. This is why Charles Darwin says these people are nuts and they're cut all over their bodies, their faces, and so on. Maybe cutting the face was more of a mark that would leave. If it was more of a friendly stabbing competition, maybe cutting the hand or cutting somewhere in the body, something that was not lethal, not going for a full stab in the body. Cutting the face was more of a matter of marking and showing. If it was a matter of real honor, if it was very close to a duel or a fight that didn't reach the point of death, well, you just mark the other guy in the cheek so as to literally leave a permanent mark of his disgrace, his dishonor, and him losing against you with a scar on the face, the cheek, maybe cutting out an eye or whatnot. But this, popular enough, would mean that a lot of guys, and as Darwin pointing out, people were cut all over the place. But the knife that the Gaucho used was the facón, and the facón was very similar to this. Now, this is more of a modern rendition, even though this is very well a traditional facón knife. There's a lot of debate about exactly what a facón knife is. You will often see knives that look a lot like this being sold to tourists, and often enough being carried by modern day gauchos, which again are not real gauchos, but more of a countryman of the modern day. They will have a knife very similar to this, but larger. And if you see the blade shape and imagine a larger version of this being called a facón, well, that's more of a kind of like a chef knife or a butcher knife, and given how wide it is and how it's often used for cooking, a gaucho that would, yes, often cook asados, meat there in the field, kill animals and so on, and do a bunch of other things. This is a more practical blade than the dagger-shaped blade that the real facón would usually involve. The real traditional facón would be either made out of a broken sword, made out of the blade of a bayonet often enough, or made out of a machete, which is this case. This is a modern facón, but made out of an old Collins machete. Okay, very narrow blade, but long, and this is kind of like a little sword, between a dagger and a short sword kind of deal here, right? But this, you can use it for other things, but it's clearly intended for fighting. Now, yes, it is true that the gaucho would have his traditional facón knife, and if he had this, and he did have it across his belt all day long, it was something that he never parted with, especially his main knife. His facón knife was always with him. If he had to cut meat, he would cut meat with his facón. If he had to cut anything, he would bring out the big knife, do whatever needed to be done. And if he had it to do something a little bit more detailed cutting, he would grab it somewhat like this. And it's not crazy to think that maybe all of this was not really left all that sharp, and maybe this part, yes, because it works perfectly well for stabbing. It works perfectly well if I have to use a tip a lot. So maybe leaving all of this for more of a choppy use, which he sure did. And if you broke the blade, no big deal. This was usually made out of a thin tang that got all the way here, and this was full of tar. And that tar, once it gets cool, it hardens. And if you broke the blade, you put this in hot water until it starts getting soft again. You remove the blade, you put a new blade in your fancy handle, something maybe maybe something like this, made out of silver. The fancier the facón knife was, the more of a status this gaucho would have. And also in his blade, in his belt, a big wide belt, he would have coins. Some say they also played a role as an armor, which makes sense. A thick leather belt with pieces of metal, just to provide some protection there in the soft body, in the abdomen. But yeah, the facón was his main blade. But it's also true that probably very few gauchos had only one knife. They would also have something like these, which are called verijero knives. Verijero because it goes close to the to your belly, so that's where you keep these knives. And no doubt, even a gaucho that had his main facón knife, he would have a small verijero blade like this one. This is a knife that I bought in a country fair in Argentina. It's made out of the bone of a ñandú, which is kind of like a, how to describe a ñandú? Like, yeah, like an ostrich, like a big damn bird thing. Well, this is the leg of the bone of the leg of a ñandú. Okay, so little knife, not even markings there on the manufacturer, but a little traditional knife for just working and cutting food and stuff and working leather and doing the kind of thing that gauchos certainly would do. My point is, the gaucho would have his main blade, but he would also have a smaller blade, something like this, something like this, and he would probably have even a longer blade, more like a sword, but something to cut even larger vegetation, use almost like a machete. That would be usually attached to his saddle with his horse. And if he had a revolver, good for him. Maybe the more the richer, the wealthier gaucho would have one with a handful of bullets, and we know historically of some gauchos that in fact did maybe even have a rifle. But he relied mostly, unlike the cowboy that relied on his revolver, the gaucho relied on this to fight, to defend himself and defend his honor. And if he had to use it for other things, he would use it as well. But he would usually have, for sure, other smaller, more practical blades, okay? And I think there's a lot there to be learned in terms of, even back in the 1830s, for a man that lived in conditions that none of us will ever go back to living like, the main use for his most important knife was fighting. Okay, so this actually makes me think a lot about what is really a survival knife. How likely are you to need a knife to defend yourself versus needing a knife to do a number of other things? And given how complex the world is now and the possibilities of things that we may find ourselves in, I still think that the more traditional survival knife of a solid full tang blade still fits that role perfectly well. But even in that day, the idea of it's not going to be wild animals. Yes, even a wild animal, I will use this against that wild animal, but mostly against other two-legged predators. That seemed to be a thing he was mostly focused on. Okay, so basically that's what I want to share with you guys. Some of these things in terms of what the traditional facón knife is, why it was important for the gaucho, a man that lived in his own way, mostly living and sleeping under the stars with little protection other than his poncho and his horse to carry him back to whatever pulperia was closest every once in a while to have a drink, maybe find a job, and socialize a little bit more. Guys, it's gonna be all for now. I hope you enjoyed this video. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Trying to get closer to that 83,000 subscribers. So if you're someone that watches the channel often, do me a favor and subscribe. See you in the next video. Take care.